Thank you, Dr. Quinn, and thanks to all of you for being here. Again, we must thank Sylvia Kaufman for being the animating spirit behind this wonderful consortium and the tradition it's built up. And to all of you who have hosted Barbara and I today and last night, we're just overwhelmed by your hospitality and graciousness. We're delighted to be with you and among you. I did not see how many people raised their hand. I'm asking because I want to know how much I need to summarize. How many of you were not able to be here earlier today? So a fair amount. Who was here earlier today wants to summarize my hour and 15 minute talk in 1 minute? I've been asked not to speak as long tonight, not by our host, but by a higher authority, my wife. So I'm not going to speak as long as I did today, but let me give you a 2-minute summary for those who weren't here as Dr. Quinn put it, the bad news. So we talked earlier today about 3 general sources of religiously inspired conflict. And by prefacing that by saying conflict itself is not bad, necessarily bad. It's inevitable in any case, in any human affairs. And the fact that we come from different perspectives and have different views and sometimes are passionate about them and disagree about them is not necessarily bad. The question is, how do we channel conflict into positive channels, to constructive channels? How do we transform conflict that begins to turn ugly, nasty, intolerant, or even violent? How do we transform that conflict toward positive social relations, toward work together for the common good? That's the question. The question is not, do we end conflict? Can we end conflict? That will not happen. So what are the conditions under which we can move forward toward positive conflict to transform it toward peaceful ends? And that's the topic tonight. This afternoon, we talked about 3 sources of conflict that turns bad, that can be intolerant, hate-filled, sometimes violent. And one is within the nature of religion itself, the nature of religion itself. Religion itself is inherently conflict-ridden. That doesn't mean that religion itself is inherently violent or must be productive of conflict that is destructive. That's not necessarily so. On the other hand, historically, we've seen it happen time and time again. And this is because in the nature of religion, human beings and human communities are always reacting as religious people to the sacred, to the divine, to a reality that by its very nature cannot be reduced to dogmas or doctrines or formulas or arguments. If I can use the term God, it's not the term that every faith tradition uses, but for a moment if I can say God as God is by definition beyond our comprehension, ineffable. The theologian Karl Rahner I quoted today said, the Catholic theologian, we do not comprehend God, God comprehends us. So there's no way that we, in our limited language and symbols and rituals and practices, which I'm going to help us celebrate tonight because they're wonderful things, but we make a categorical error when we believe in our quest for certainty and for linear thinking and for more precision and more denotative language, when we try to fit that experience of the sacred into Procrustean categories that don't allow us to have open space for dialogue or for even questioning our own purchase on what that experience of God or the sacred or the divine means. So it's in the nature of religion to be ambiguous. That is, there's no definitive statement about or expression of the encounter with the sacred, whether it's an encounter that comes through being present, as I said today, at the birth of a child, which is a wondrous and awesome and mysterious and tremendous and fascinating event, or whether it's coming down from Mount Sinai or listening to the Buddha's first homily or whatever it may be. There are so many experiences that human beings have had throughout history that would be an encounter with this mysterious, soul-shaking, uncreated, life-giving reality that we would call the sacred or the religious, or the divine rather, or the ineffable. There's so many experiences, and we then have to step back and first respond in silence to that that moment of encounter with something or someone who is not us, and yet who masters us and creates us, and before whom we feel our deep contingency, our deep dependence. We stand back in silence, in awe, in wonder, and then we begin to, as we must, because it's an ecstatic experience, we stand outside of ourselves in the encounter with this sacred, but it's also an experience that requires communication. It requires us to speak. What was it to be in the presence of this remarkable reality of the sacred? We're driven to communicate it, and we must communicate it first in elusive, connotative, poetic language. We can't rush to definitive statements that presume to comprehend or denote what this is in some way. So when I want to describe to you the first kiss of my beloved at age 17, I don't say, well, she had been eating something with garlic, and so there was a little there in the breath, and my lip got caught on her braces, and we're not going to rush to the denotative. We're going to say 1,000 fireworks exploded in my head when I kissed her. Now, your interlocutor is not going to say, did you go to the doctor? Are you okay with all those fireworks going off in your head? They realize you're using connotative or poetic language to express something profound that really you can't contain in language, and you don't want to hear about the braces or the garlic. That's not the point. The point is not the sometimes sordid details. The point is, what is the truth, the deep truth of my encounter with the sacred, with the ineffable? So we talk poetically, we talk elusively, we talk religiously, symbolically. Of course, there is a blessed rage for order and description and boundary making, and so we move to doctrines, and we move to more precise statements, and we create communities. And these communities of faith and belief and shared experience must be regulated by authority. And yet there's this tension between that regulation, that authority, the need to share and to agree to some degree on what we think we mean by God, the sacred, by Christ or Muhammad or the Buddha or whoever. We are a community who must be in some way one, or at least share a consensus. And so we do move more deeply into our traditions, into our teachings. But we can make a big error when we make of those teaching idols, false gods, and we rest in the boundaries, and we rest in the precision, and we close off the space for dialogue within our communities and for mutual understanding of going deeper into what we mean by saying that we are a people of compassion, or we are a people of forgiveness, or we have a vengeful God or a wrathful God. Whatever we may claim, there's always the invitation to go deeper into that and to wed that kind of language with our ongoing experience of life and how we change over time. So the traditions that we inhabit and create, that is, those shared practices and beliefs and rituals, are handed down, traditio, to hand down. At the same time, to hand down is also to traduce, to betray. So we are, even in the act of communicating across time and space and geography and borders, we're always adapting the message to a degree. So there's this tension between continuity and witness, but also adaptation and a kind of new message to every generation that's in continuity with the old. That's within a religious tradition. And then these religious traditions are multiple internally. They're internally plural. And there's a tendency in these religions to be more absolutist, to resist that kind of fluidity, to want to be definitive, to draw boundaries. Because after all, aren't we reflecting one God, one master, right? And therefore, we're uncomfortable with the fluidity, the open spaces, the ambiguity, the ambivalences that come with that poetic language, that come with different opinions and different points of view. And so the tension there is between leaving that space open within our communities and across communities for that kind of exploration of our own experiences in light of what we've received on one hand, and then the urge to be more absolute, to make sure our teachings and practices are definite and bounded and clear. So there's that tension as a second source of conflict, a tendency toward absolutism. Our way is the right way. We are the orthodox, those who give the right praise, and everybody else is outside that circle. So a source of conflict is the ambiguous nature of religion itself, its ambivalence, and the contestation about interpretation, even within the community, conflict about what's orthodox within the community, and then the tendency to absolutize our creeds and confessions and statements that would alienate others because of that absolutism, close off space for dialogue and creativity within and across the traditions. And then the third and final part of the talk today was the next step in these kind of three interrelated causes, or sources, I should say, of religiously inspired conflict, is a kind of modern logic, a kind of modern mode of reacting to the pluralism of the modern world. It's secularism, that is, the fact that we are increasingly cheek by jowl with one another, whatever our traditions. We are plural, we are multiple, we are Muslim and Hindu and agnostic and atheist and Christian and Jewish, wherever we live. But due to modern communications technology, we may not have to live next door to the other. We are confronted by the other through our technologies all the time. And so one of the logics, one of the religious modes available, there are many in the modern period. Liberalism is the name of one of them. Communitarianism, fundamentalism. These are all modes of traditional religious communities responding to and reacting to a set of circumstances that the entire world faces. This pluralism, secularism, the rise of science, kind of agnostic or atheistic science in some presentations, increasing materialism, increasing consumerism. The whole panoply of things that we associate with the last 300 to 500 years of modernity. So a logic has developed in some religious communities that are particularly conflict prone in the sense of violent or intolerant conflict, a mode of reaction to what is perceived to be the marginalization of religion. The marginalization of religion is the cause of all of our problems. This is a trope you'll find within Islam and Judaism and Christianity, within extremist movements, sometimes called, awkwardly at times, fundamentalisms in these traditions, that a reaction against the marginalization of religion that is coupled with a selective retrieval of those elements of the religious tradition that are most useful for combat or for othering or for excluding people from the circle of the elect, because we need to fight back. And the first enemy may be our fellow religionists, our co-religionists, who don't understand that it's not enough to be a peace-loving Muslim in this day and age when they're out to take our souls as Muslims, when they are colonizing us and disrespecting us and making war against us. It's not enough to be an ordinary Muslim. One must become a combative, a militant, an extremist Muslim, and so we must retrieve those aspects of our tradition that call us to slay the infidel. I use Islam, I could use Sikhism, Christianity, Buddhism. There are these texts within these traditions that I called this morning or this afternoon emergency clauses. Well, normally we're peace-loving, forgiving, reconciling peoples, whether Hindu or Muslim or Buddhist or Christian, but when things get tough, when it's apocalyptic time, when it's end times, when it's dark for our people, there is the emergency clause. Now you can pick up the sword and you must pick up the sword. These are present in all the texts of various traditions. And so this mode, this fundamentalist type mode, is one that lends us to a defensive posture, to building walls and enclaves and striking out from beneath those, beyond those kind of walls. And we retrieve those elements of the tradition that are sometimes embedded in minor chords, but that are prone to violence, that are militant. And we create, in that fundamentalist mode, a rationale and a way forward that is based on the premise that we are at war. Spiritual warfare or literal warfare, because the way the modern period has encroached upon our sacred turf. And there's an absolutism to that logical approach, that logic of fundamentalism. There's a dualism. We are the sacred, you are the profane, we are the children of darkness, we're the children of light, you're the children of darkness. So there are firm boundaries. There's traps set to determine whether you're an outsider or whether you're not. If you want to run a Southern Baptist seminary at a certain time in the 20th century, and even in some places still today, you sign on a dotted line that says, I believe that the Bible is completely free of error, historical, theological, biological, as well as religious theological. If you're a modern engineer running that seminary or a modern person, you suspend disbelief and you submit, because that attempt to assert the kind of supernatural, the not merely rational aspect of the faith, that's a marker of identity. Are you a true believer? Are you a compromiser? Are you West-toxicated? Are you poisoned by, in a way you don't even know, the material, consumerist, communist, capitalist, modern world that tries to drain us of our religious commitments? So you are called in this mode of logic to be a person of conflict, to be a person who embraces conflict and who sees the world in a dualistic lens, the good versus the evil, the righteous versus the fallen, and so on. And then last but not least, this conflictual mode that lends itself often to violence is premised on the notion that we are in the end times, or an important moment in history in which the normal rules of the game are suspended, and we must indeed take up the sword in order to oppose the unrighteous, because this is not ordinary time. If we don't fight back, if we don't defend the sacred truths, we will be eclipsed, we will be no more. And again, you can retrieve those kinds of texts as well. So that was this afternoon. It was sources within religion itself and the ways in which religion that is often, this came out in the panel discussions, religion which is often subordinated to or weakened by or influenced or infected by nationalism or territorial designs or sovereignty that really don't have anything to do directly with the precepts or rituals or teachings of the faith, but which are in a way manipulate and use Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Hinduism to support nationalist causes. As today in India, Hindutva movement, Hindu nationalism, in which in this remarkably pluralistic, multi-religious, democratic society, there is a core of Hindu nationalism that says to be Hindu, to truly be Hindu, you must acknowledge that this is a Hindu nation, and therefore the Muslims and the Christians and the Jains and the Buddhists and all the rest, if they are to be citizens of this nation, they must become part of Hindutva. They must acknowledge the cultural supremacy of Hinduism and understand their own faith, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, whatever it may be that's not Hinduism, within the parameters set by Hinduism. That's very much at play in India today. So that's a too long summary of, but now you're caught up if you followed any of what I just said, since I did it so quickly. But I hope I conveyed some of it, that there is sources of conflict within religion itself. They need not necessarily be destructive or inimical to others. Well, the good news for tonight is that those very same dynamics and characteristics of religion also produce remarkable acts of compassion and mercy and defense of human rights in the modern period, to use that term, peace building, that those very depths of religious response to the sacred are capable of interpreting the sacred, understanding the divine in a way that is conducive of and deepens our purchase on what makes us more fully human, what makes us more like the angels, which makes us open to compassion and to reconciliation and to forgiveness, which makes us embrace the enemy, or at least consider that as an option. Those resources are available in religion as well. And this requires interpretation. It requires lifting up those aspects of religion that speak loudly and powerfully, as most religions do, to the need to reach out to the other, to open oneself within the religious community to the spaces for dialogue and understanding, and also the spaces beyond the religious community and other religious communities and in the so-called secular world. So that's where we are. And tonight we're going to talk about I'm going to talk about the conditions under which some of them we can find that religions come together in collaboration. Within the large religious tradition, Christianities work together, Judaism's work together, Islam's, but also across. When do we work together across our religious communities? When do we collaborate? What are the conditions under which that happens? I know that several of you in this room are really steeped in, familiar with the language of interfaith dialogue and collaboration, and I won't even begin to cover some of the insights you have about steps toward robust interfaith dialogue. So I invite those comments in the period we have for discussion in about 20, 30 minutes. So I'll focus now on some conditions for unleashing, if you will, those aspects of religious traditions and religious communities that lend themselves to dialogue and collaboration for the common good. There are three conditions, I think, for this to happen, or there could be many others, but I'll mention three. The first is the practice of parallel construction. I'll explain what I mean. All you English teachers know what parallel construction is. But when I say the practice of parallel construction, I mean one who is committed to fostering dialogue and collaboration, cooperation for the common good beyond specific religious injunctions to a kind of common understanding, have to refuse to choose between two competing goods and attempt to bring both of them together. On the one hand, it is sometimes said, when you bring people of different religions together, or you bring them together with secular folks, or you bring different kinds of Muslims together, don't talk about meaning, theology, metaphysics. Don't talk about big questions. Talk about concrete issues. Talk about how we're going to work together in Sierra Leone to build a library that the faiths will contribute to. Talk about how we're going to have an interreligious PTA, or we're going to work together to bring clean and non-toxic drinking water to Grand Rapids. Whatever it may be. Focus on the issues. Assume that there's common good. Assume that we all want the same basic things. Leave out those issues that can cause us to fight with one another. So let's not talk about God. Let's not talk about doctrines. Let's not talk about eternal life. Don't do that. It is going to muck up the works and we'll never get anywhere. And then there's some who would rather talk about nothing else. The issues, they can be handled by the politicians and the public works people. What we need to come together with in our communal dialogue is to talk about the big issues of meaning, life and death, eternal life, sin, redemption, whatever the categories may be in the traditions. My first recommendation on this, from my own experience and what I've read, is both of these extremes would be wrong-headed. They would be extremes. Parallel construction means that you have to construct the dialogue in the community in a parallel fashion. That is, one has to create an environment and a space in which there is freedom to continually to go to the issues under the tip of the iceberg, the more profound issues. They have to be discussed. And also, one has to discuss concrete issues. They have to be done in tandem. They have to be done in conversation and dialogue. This comes from primarily for me, not only from what I've read and studied, but my own experience in a project we've started at Notre Dame 7, 8 years ago called Contending Modernities is the name of this project. And the idea from Notre Dame was to bring together Catholic and Muslim and secular interlocutors not to talk about theological issues, but to work on common problems. So how do we've got a working group that looks at bioethical issues. How do the religious communities together engage with secular ethicists about reproductive technologies or about end-of-life issues? All the things that are raised by medical technological developments. Let's focus on those. We're not doing interreligious dialogue. That was our initial thought, naively. We're going to bring Muslims and Catholics and other Christians and secular folks who have focused on medical ethical issues, concrete issues, together, and we're going to be in dialogue. We're going to first, we thought, come together as believers of various kinds, and then be in dialogue with the secular ethicist and learn from them and contribute and bring to secular ethics the wisdom and insights from these religious traditions, which are often ignored, overlooked by doctors, physicians, by people who fund the National Institute for Health, and so on. So let's bring a religious dimension, because something's very much missing in bioethics, in medical ethics, in the way we think about healthcare in general. And we think the religions have something to say. Well, we do. But we were wrong in how we designed the project, which became immediately apparent when we brought together Muslim and Christian, including Catholic, and different secular people who have strong ideas about organ transplants, say, or genetic engineering, or cloning, or abortion, or birth control, health-related issues. Very strong ideas from all vantage points. And we thought there's enough to keep us busy just in negotiating those differences. What we found after several years of bringing these folks together is that no matter how much we focus them on this particular biomedical, so organ transplants is a big issue in the Muslim world, and not in the Muslim world alone. But the question, first of all, was not only the technical dimensions of organ transplants, but who gets them and under what conditions? And isn't it socially unjust and outrageous that the poor are denied them and the wealthy they're given, et cetera? So the first thing we realized with it is that the ethical issues were not technical issues as much as they were issues of meaning and value. What's right, what's wrong, who gets access? It was less about, well, this is not orthodox or religiously correct, although that's part of it. But it was more about access. And then we also found that we could not keep our interlocutors focused on specific concrete issues. And we didn't really try this, but even any instance that where do they want to start? What is our shared anthropology? That's what they wanted to talk about. It drove me crazy for a while because we didn't make much progress on what I wanted in my American, let's make a change and develop policies that everyone can respect and blah, blah, blah. What they want to talk about is, hey, it's the early 21st century and our traditions need to rethink their theological anthropologies or their understanding of the human person in the light of these medical and scientific advances. And we have something to say from Islam and Christianity and Judaism about who the human person is. And even our own thinking about who the human person is being transformed when we learn about DNA, about what can be done in genetic engineering, about what the human person might be. How do we rethink our own theological traditions in light of these scientific questions? So we learned very quickly that you couldn't isolate those deeper questions about the human person, about the spirit, about meaning and identity. You can't isolate them from concrete issues to move forward. It seems obvious to me now that how dumb we were to start it that way, but it wasn't as obvious until we actually brought the people together over many meetings in many places around the world, from the Gulf, Persian Gulf, and to Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and places in between, that they said, you only will advance in interreligious understanding through parallel construction. through trying to do these things in a kind of delicate but important balance. So you provide space for people to speak and to explore and to let them reflect on how changes in the contemporary situation that we live in are making them rethink. And then they move back in kind of a rhythm towards specific issues. It was said today, Professor Das was on the panel, made a very important, simple point that's absolutely crucial. I talked a lot today, and we've talked about Christianity and Islam and Judaism and these religious traditions. In a way, they don't exist. They do. Well, of course, we can speak of Christianity, say, but we really must only speak of Christians and Buddhists and Muslims. That is, we can sometimes get put off by when we think about these large traditions and not remember that they are inhabited by real human beings who live in the here and now with their own concrete issues, and that they're not themselves thinking of themselves or understanding themselves to be the complete embodiment and incarnation of 2,000 years of Christianity or twice that long of Judaism or whatever it may be. They are individuals navigating these traditions. They have multiple voices and identities in a way that they're bringing together in one person. And we have to understand that they are fluid. They are changing. So when we're talking about dialogue and collaborations between faiths, we shouldn't, as I sometimes do, think of these as chock-a-block monoliths. There is our representative Jew. There is our representative Christian. That person is the burden of that person, whether it's a rabbi or a priest or just a member of the congregation, is to somehow represent all of Judaism. That's not the way it works. So folks are navigating their own religious identities and they're navigating issues, and when you can do that in collaboration and conversation, it's really creative and it is life-giving, and something of the grace and creativity of religion in general, of the moral imagination of religions, comes forward. And that concept of moral imagination, I'm going to say more about, is absolutely imperative. So item number one, practice parallel construction. Number two, this is something that might be familiar to some of you who've been part of this consortium in the past, and I'm taking a page out of the book of my wonderful mentor, Martin Marty, who's been part of this consortium. So number two is take the risk of hospitality. Take the risk of hospitality. While you're engaging big questions of life and death and meaning, as well as concrete social issues, in order to plumb the depths, even while working together to build greater measures of justice and peace to bring these measures to the social landscape, one must take the risk of hospitality. This involves the cultivation of tolerance, we know that, and here tolerance as over against intolerance, impatient, prejudging. So it seems obvious that we have to foster tolerance, and that, of course, tolerance is in short supply in our national discourse, our political discourse, and even in our religious congregations. The notion that we don't prejudge, that we tolerate, that our first mode is to listen and to understand before one jumps to the conclusion. So when I say tolerance is just the first step, I don't mean to minimize the difficulty of fostering in ourselves and our communities tolerance, but that's the beginning. Not to prejudge, not to be impatient. But this must reach beyond a what can be called a soft tolerance, that is, overlooking what you don't like about the other or what you don't agree with, overlooking it in a kind of soft tolerance, which is kind of condescending. I'm going to pretend you didn't say that. I'm going to pretend you don't really believe that what I consider nonsense. That's a kind of soft, queasy tolerance, right? It's condescending. And we have to move beyond that to what we call a hard tolerance, which is to say, this is a hard one tolerance because I've really listened to you and I don't agree. And let me tell you why, but I'm taking you seriously. I'm tolerating, in a sense, not in a condescending way, but I'm accepting the premise that my convictions and commitments and forms of expression and yours deserve to be in the same conversation with kind of equal weight to begin with. Now let us debate and deliberate and even argue together civilly. That's a hard tolerance. You really do take seriously what the other's position is or positions. But Marty and others talk about going beyond even this hard tolerance where we're debating, we're arguing with respect the other's position. So we go beyond this to a position that is best expressed as positioning oneself as a host who welcomes others fully into one's home and is so open to not only the surface beliefs and symbols of the other, but also to the creencias of the other. Let me explain what that means. So the risk of hospitality means, for this moment I'll imagine I'm the host. I'm hosting this engaged encounter, this encounter with the other, with those who are not of my tradition or community. And it's more than I want to hear your views and we'll debate about them. I am putting myself in a position where I want you to discuss and I want us to engage not just our beliefs, but the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset of the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, talked about creencias. And the way he described creencias, if I can quote him directly, is I'll get the quote here in a second, but it's not that not the ideas that one has, but the ideas that one is. So it's not ideas or belief that one has, but that really who you are, how those ideas and beliefs, these creencias, these deep-seated, profound commitments, convictions, really reflect who you are. It's not simply I believe this or I hold that, but this is at the heart of my being. This is my soul speaking when I speak about the sanctity of life. It's not merely a belief or even a creed. It's really where the heart and the mind meet, and it's creencia. So the risk of hospitality is to invite an exchange of creencias, and as the host, hospitality means that I put myself at the risk of being transformed by my encounter with the other, of actually changing. Now, if we pause for a moment and think about what I quickly reviewed from the earlier talk, that religions are often seem to be monolithic, and here the stone tablets come down from Mount Sinai, so to speak. These are living religions. Those 10 Commandments have had a lot of back and forth and dialogue and fluidity and interpretation. What do they mean? So when we talk about hospitality, it's not necessarily, and the risk of transforming oneself, that in itself doesn't necessarily violate profound religious sensibilities. Religion is about transformation. It's about being transformed in the encounter with the sacred. And the risk of hospitality is a way of acknowledging that you walk into my home as the sacred. There's I hate to quote the Benedictines in a Dominican institution, but St. Benedict said, welcome everyone as Christ. What does that mean? That everyone who crosses the threshold is sacred. What does it mean to be deeply religious in an encounter with the other, putative other? To welcome one as one would welcome Christ, as Christ. That means that you're going at a level that's beyond mere belief and opinion and even commitment to the level of creencias, and that in that encounter, you are opening yourself as the host to the risk of being changed and transformed, and leaving the consequences to fall where they may. So unless we take the risk of hospitality, we don't have the necessary condition for enduring, fruitful, interreligious or intrareligious collaboration. Otherwise, we're posturing. Otherwise, we're doing something other than real encounter. We're posing, in a way. This is very hard. Marty and others have written on this. Marty wrote a wonderful book called When Faiths Collide. And there are a couple of wonderful chapters, one called The Risk of Hospitality. I commend it to you. So that is the second of these conditions for engaged interreligious collaboration. Let me just quote one thing from Marty's book before I move to the third and final of these conditions, because it's complicated. When we think about what does it mean to take this risk, to be hospitable, but also to be true to our own traditions, to be who we are, to stand self-consciously in a tradition of Buddhism or Hinduism, Catholicism, whatever it may be, to take that seriously. So, in going beyond tolerance, even a hard tolerance to hospitality, Marty writes, I make use of my awareness of how much my faith, philosophy, and community mean to me. I grow conscious of how delicate and fragile are the holds of faith, how difficult the professing of a philosophy, how important but how tenuous belonging to a community can be. Whoever is reflective about these will find it easier to picture how precarious is the others, the strangers hold on what they value. When we're aware of our own fragility and uncertainty, which we talked about earlier today, the uncertainty that comes with faith, quoting Paul Tillich, the doubt that comes with faith, that's an integral element of faith, our uncertainty, our questioning, our doubts, and how fragile they can be. When we examine our own fragility, we recognize that the other is also in this position, so to speak. I can use my own sense of attachment telegraphed to the other, Marty writes, as a warrant, a guarantee that I will not act against them, because we're both fragile in our faith, however much we pose and seem to appear otherwise. If action toward the stranger is based on force or is an effort to proselytize, he writes, quote, this cannot fail to engender in the other the conviction that I am acting out of self-interest and in order to satisfy my desire to be superior or to proselytize. Or worse, that I am a servant of a God of prey whose goal is to annex and enslave. Expressing hospitality does not mean that there should never be efforts at witnessing, evangelizing, or creating a situation in which such conversations can occur. But it does alter the character of the approach to any of these. Sharing your faith in a way that might be evangelical, so to speak, that has to be modified within the context of mutual fragility and respect. Marty's counsel is to be hospitable, to find philosophical reasons to practice hospitality, and then to act upon them. This does not mean ignoring or otherwise hiding my deepest convictions, my creencias. To the contrary, a quote from Marty, and I used this in part of our dialogue today on the panel. If you're invited to my house and accept, or if you knock on my door and are welcome, I as a Christian will not remove the crucifix, icons, or other Christian symbolic art from my wall. Out of context and in isolation, some of the figures will at least vaguely recall incidents that could irritate people of other faiths, as they may also be disconcerting to many who profess the faith from which the images issue. The cross, for that matter, has caused and can cause some Christians and many Jews and Muslims to shudder. The stories behind such symbols of colonialism, of oppression at the hands of Christians, for example. The stories behind such symbols, however much in need of interpretation in context they may be, are integral to the Christian faith, just as the basic tenets of Judaism and the symbols of Judaism are integral to Jewish faith. to obscure the symbols that are both taken for granted in my house and at the same time important to those who live there will only create confusion or deception. My burden or delight may be to interpret them and not to pretend that they are not part of the history of what draws Christians together and what may push them apart from others. So what he's enjoining is self-criticism of a tradition as a healthy way to engage in dialogue without abandoning or being or eliding or ignoring the tradition. This, again, to repeat something that was said earlier today, is what we might say is the traditional mode of religiosity in the modern world, to use tradition. Here, one tries to avoid, it's almost impossible not to do this, but if you are a traditionalist, in the way I'm using the term now, you are stuck. You're stuck with your tradition. You're stuck with its warts, its historical dark moments or millennia, its violations of common human dignity, but you're also stuck with its moments of grace, its resources for wholeness, for humility, for compassion, for service. You're stuck with that entire ambivalent reality of the human response to the sacred. So to be a traditionalist is not to say, I'm ignoring all the horrible things that have been done in the name of the cross. I'm not celebrating those. It's part of the broken myth of Christianity. Nor am I ignoring that cross really means for me that God reveals God's self to be one with us in suffering and to be broken under sin and under death as we are, and somehow to redeem that situation. Both these things are true about the cross and other symbols. And again, we can use other religious traditions. There is the darkness, there is the light. Presumably, we would think in that place where will and power are one of goodness, that it will only be the light. But in this earth, in the context where things need to be interpreted and owned up to and celebrated as appropriate, to be traditional in the modern mode is to struggle with it, to be attached to it in a good sense, but also to be self-critical and recognize the fragility of it and the brokenness, to use Tillich's term, of those myths and symbols. They're not isolated from the history, from the use to which they've been put, whether it's the use put to them by the followers of Muhammad or of Buddha or of Christ. So, self-criticism of a tradition is a key to the practice of hospitality. A certain bit of house cleaning will occur before the guest comes, but not, as I say, the eclipsing of the tradition. So, take the risk of hospitality. Number 3, and the final condition I want to put before you, then we can have a discussion of this: bridge religious encounter to religious peace building. Religious encounter can be understood, I think, helpfully through the lens of religious peace building. How do we build peace together? What is our experience with peace building, which has its own literature, its own dynamics? How can that help us understand interfaith or interreligious dialogue? And here, peace building is a term that's used almost in opposition to conflict resolution. So there are experts who try to resolve a conflict. There's a conflict in a nation over water rights between two groups. My job is to get to yes. Okay? We just want to get to yes. We want to fix that water main. We want to bring clean water. We want to talk about the issues. We're not going to talk about anything else. We're going to talk about our deep disagreements. This is like curing the symptoms but not the disease in conflict. Conflict transformation says this is a long-term process of building healthy relations where there have been destructive relations. This is what it is to build peace over time. The conflict is transformed. So what does this mean for peace builders? What does it mean for people who really want to enter into this deep risk of hospitality and build sustainable relationships across divisions over time? First of all, it means that one has the proper conception of time. My friend and colleague John Paul Lederach, known to many of you in the peace-building arena, says, what do you think? If it took this long to get into this mess in Israel-Palestine, in Sri Lanka, in race relations in this country, you know, if it took us this long, you think it's going to take us this long to get to heal that and to have it transformed? No, it's going to take this long. You know, if you think, what is my great-grandmother? I'm from the South. I don't have to be from the South to have a legacy in my family of racism, but I do. I remember my grandparents. Every generation is a little bit less racist in my family, but we haven't shaken it off. And if you think, I can remember my I shouldn't laugh about this, but it's not something I'll put on the resume, but I live from Shreveport, Louisiana, which at one time had the highest concentration of KKK members in the nation. This is not something I think they advertise now, but it was kind of the hotbed of Southern racism for a long time. And I have a picture of a great-grandmother dressed in this beautiful gown. I saw the picture there. Isn't that nice? That's her great-grandmother. Yes, that's her Klan gown. So Lederach says, when you think about building constructive relationships over time that turn the conflict from deadly and hate-filled and intolerant to productive, of positive social outcomes of peace and justice, and et cetera, it's not going to happen overnight. If you're not in for the long haul, if you're not persistent, if you're not willing to take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back sometimes, you will not build peace and you will not have constructive engagement with the other. I don't normally wake up in the middle of the night in tears, but I did this summer because I woke up and I happened to check the phone, the iPhone, and there was a notification that the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies was mentioned 7 times in the peace accords that are trying to end the longest running civil war in this hemisphere in Colombia. The reason I cried is because I had watched those peace builders, John Paul and Francisco Diaz and others. I know how they live. I was privileged to accompany them on many trips and to be their resident bureaucrat for many years. And it is tough work. Stitching together these relationships in a place like Colombia, where it's filled with distrust and terrible violence that reaches across generations, unspeakable violence. And these folks work together to try to rebuild relationships. And I was just moved that they've developed this way of trying to solve the problem of why half of peace accords in the world fail in 5 years and the fighting starts again. And they've coded all these provisions and implementations of peace accords, and now they're working together to try to help the Colombian peace process be implemented. The problem is often not that you have a peace process and a negotiated settlement that's signed. The tough part is implementing it, getting it to stick. Why doesn't it work? So these guys have been working. Suddenly, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate mentions them 2 or 3 times. They're asked to go implement the accords. I was weeping. Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, says, wait and wait and wait, because there's a moment when history and hope rhyme. Look for that moment where history and hope rhyme. And it's rare, and it takes a long time. So one of the lessons for interreligious engagement is endurance, a kind of spiritual practice that recognizes what is possible and the length of how long it takes to build these relationships. And then one of the things that we learned from the peace builders who gravitated to the religious traditions was that they are remarkable reservoirs of resources for reconciliation, ritual, right? The rituals that religions that are really about time and space and memory and healing, the practices of compassion that are practices of these religious traditions, of all of them. John Paul Lederach, who is not Catholic, wanted to work with the Catholics, not only because sociologically they tend to be present around the world at every level. The hierarchy, the bishops say, the local parish priest, and then transnationally the papacy. We didn't tell him when we were recruiting him that those levels never agree with one another. They're often fighting. We just left that from him. But nonetheless, he wanted a presence. But more importantly for John Paul, he found the idea of Eucharist as presence. Very important. What does it mean to be present to the suffering? What does it mean to be present to the other? What does it mean when a tradition sacralizes presence and says it's more than the superficial? There's a depth dimension to presence. To accompany someone on a journey to face the accuser or the violent person, accompaniment. What does it mean to say accompaniment is a deep spiritual practice? It's not just a function, not just a technique. It speaks to the depths of the soul. What does it mean for us to retrieve Jewish sense of hospitality to the stranger as a deep ethical and moral and religious commitment, not merely a function or a tactic? So the religious traditions have within them these remarkable spiritual and moral resources that Lederach and others refer to as a moral imagination. And unless you can plumb the depths of that imagination, the conversation's going to be maybe tolerant, maybe hard tolerance, but fairly superficial and easily broken. One of the ways to keep the endurance that is to address the question of time and healing and reconciliation and how long that takes, is to go deep. To keep the eye on the particular issue, but to go deep. I fear I'm already in trouble with my wife, if not with you. So I'm going to stop there and open this up for discussion and question. Those are three conditions. Just to repeat, the condition of parallel construction, blending the conversation about big issues and big kind of philosophical, theological with concrete issues, taking the risk of hospitality, and studying the practices of building peace that within religions, the resources religions bring to the building of peace around the world, and there's a lot of literature on this. And culling from that literature and from those experiences, practices of compassion, healing, reconciliation, and hospitality that the religions excel in describing, often to themselves, and now they're being called to describe those practices and those virtues to a broader public. So those are three conditions, and I do have a piece on some of the models, some of the aspects of models for this kind of reconciliation and this kind of collaboration, but since I've talked too long, I'll try to smuggle them into the question period. So the floor is open. I'd be happy to, yeah. So.
We do have mics. Luke and I. Good question.
I think that, just don't have a question, just a comment. If you could maybe help us out with the difference between tolerance and acceptance. It seems that in public discourse there's a conflation at a popular level. People resent the idea of tolerance because they interpret that means that I have to accept things that I don't want to accept. Whereas there's a tradition of civil tolerance or civic tolerance in American society. And I wonder if we need to revive that sense of at least allowing the space that we need before we get to acceptance.
Yes. One of the questions raised by that important distinction is what are you being asked to accept? Are you being asked to accept in a spirit of civic tolerance that you have the right to your opinion? Are you being asked to accept that you have the right to your opinion and I accept and welcome that opinion into the kind of circle of discourse that's acceptable and I'll think about it? So what is the nature of acceptance there? And I think it does exist, as you said, at a spot somewhere between what we call soft tolerance and hard tolerance. I'll leave it at that for now, just to try to make my answer shorter, but it's a great question to follow up on.
Your third point on bridge religious encounters. Last Sunday we actually had the
Catholic common prayer service at St. Andrews, and that was a beautiful peace-building activity for sure. One thing, and I didn't catch your name. Beirut. We spoke before this started a little bit, but I've found a lot of commonalities in how different faith groups treat their water source. Even Catholics, praying over the holy water, and she mentioned some beautiful things about the Holy Spring, excuse me, in Saudi Arabia.
Zamzam, the water of Zamzam.
So I'm just curious, I just think that's a strong commonality that I have yet to really hear about in different faith groups, and, or excuse me, in an interfaith setting, because I just find there's just a lot of similarities with how different faith groups treat water.
Treat water in particular? I mean, I think you will find comparatively that this is one of the symbols, images that is consistent across. And of course it comes, and that the value, the importance of water is connected to life and connected to fertility and connected to growth is even more deeply accentuated now across the world in a period where this is such a precious commodity, such a precious quality. And if you did a serious sustained study, I don't know of one of water as such, you'll find, I think you would find that water is one of the elemental points of comparison, but there are others as well. One of which is land, in a different land, in the same way water operates on various levels of meaning, various registers. So it's out of the very face of it, it is something that is obviously necessary for life, and that there are conflicts about water. Resource conflicts are going to get worse, not better, as this century unfolds. So on a very kind of, I'd say, mundane level, as it were, water becomes important. And then the deep symbolism of that, that is part of religious imagery across, plays on that kind of, if I can say, mundane level, but speaks of, uses the valence or the meaning of water to show, by analogy, the gifts of the Spirit or the gifts of eternal life. So there's that. Land operates similarly in this sense. Many of the disputes, many of the conflicts around the world today are about land. And who owns land? And what is the land? Israel, Palestine, just to take one, there are many others, is what land is sacred and who holds it. I heard a riveting presentation by a religious Jew in Israel who, on one hand, belongs to the Gush Emunim, a movement that settled those and tried to expropriate Palestinian lands, who says we're wrong because our vision of land was too narrow, and land is part of what it is to be human on this earth, and that land is not a possession only of a few, and the whole land of Israel can no longer be considered to be that chunk of earth. We have to speak more religiously and theologically about what land means and how we rethink humanity over the question of land. So anyway, I don't want to go on too long, but there are these kind of elemental aspects of being human, especially in our own day and age, that are absolutely necessary, that work on various registers. It's not a coincidence or an accident that they will be absolutely central to religious symbolism and imagery across traditions, because there's so much of the heart metaphors for and actual instantiations of what it means to be alive, what it means to prosper, to grow, to flourish. So how do we understand those terms as something we all hold in common is also a bridge to concrete environmental issues, say, concrete issues of conflict and dispute, where you go deeper and you think about, you reflect upon what does land mean in our history of our people? How precious is it? How do we understand it in that more humane and holistic and inclusive way when we return to a particular conflict? How do we, in a way, both desacralize the land, by which I mean, or maybe I shouldn't say to desacralize it, how do we make it less an exclusive possession of our group, an exclusive entitlement, and recognize its true sacrality, meaning that it's part of being human. So how do we deterritorialize it and reduce that kind of possessiveness that sometimes comes with the religiously inspired conflict by recognizing that it's universal, that it's good for all humanity, and it is sacred, but not sacred only for us. So there's a lot to be done with that. This is one back here.
Thank you. I guess, sentiment of territorialism probably dovetails well with this question. You spoke of the risk of hospitality, and I'm wondering if you could maybe explain a bit what happens when both parties in the encounter or in the conflict view themselves as the host and have trouble recognizing themselves as guests, and how can that possibly dovetail with that territorialism and what that means for rearranging furniture when we're not sure who's happening?
Great question. This allows me to get one of my elements of models of constructive collaboration because I think it's part of the answer, or one of the answers. When I said earlier that religion's about interpretation, and that communities can be dragged in this or that direction toward, hey, I own this, we all are the host here, toward a kind of competition for who's the host, if you will. You can be dragged in this or that way, because many of these religious traditions are heavily dependent upon the interpreters, the authoritative interpreters of their tradition. I don't know if I just said it now or earlier today, that the Quran, that Arabic is the sacred language, and yet most Muslims don't speak Arabic. So there's a heavy dependence on the interpreter of the Quran who does speak Arabic in Uganda, maybe not well, but can spout a bit of Arabic and have the authority of interpreting. The point here is that because religions require interpretation, which way do we list, which way do we tack, how do we understand this, what's our attitude toward the other, leadership is absolutely central. I mean, we all know leaders are important to begin with in any organization or in any movement. But when you're dealing with religion, who is the leader? Who are the leaders? Who has authority over the interpretation? And that's why, to your question, if you can't cultivate servant leadership, this will fail. If you're and this is, I must say, in my experience working with religious leaders, not all of them, but they are turf protectors par excellence, especially in conflict zones. Especially in conflict zones. They believe that their role as religious leaders, and please, any religious leader in the room, please look the other way. I'm not talking about you, of course. But to be fair, there is a Catholic bishop here. Let me talk about the Catholic bishops in Africa. I once was asked to speak in Baltimore at St. Mary's Seminary. A number of African leaders, bishops, Catholic bishops, were brought together by Notre Dame and Catholic Relief Services to talk to them about being the practices of religious peace building that I invoked. It's about servant leadership. And I went into this conversation naively thinking, well, these bishops understand already that they are peace builders and that they're dialogue experts. And it occurred to me after the first half day that they had no such preconception or self-image. And it's certainly not their fault. They finally told me, like, don't you get it, stupid? We were not trained as peace builders. In the seminary, we didn't have courses on peace building or conflict transformation or dialogue. We were trained to, in the case of Catholic bishops and priests, to celebrate the sacraments, to understand the theology of the church, to understand the liturgy, etc. It was like, duh, I get it. Now, I wanted to say to them in my pompous way, well, wait a second, aren't you the disciples of the Prince of Peace, for God's sake? Aren't you peace built? Well, yeah, we are. but we don't know, they didn't quite say we don't know what you're talking about. They do, because they are called upon, African Catholic bishops and other bishops in the Catholic tradition and in other traditions, to be mediators. Cardinal Anayakin of Nigeria, when I once said, the church is no longer siding with the state, it's, under John Paul II, it's doing more civil society work as kind of a nonpartisan actor. Cardinal Anayakin raised, well, that's fine, Scott, except I am the state in Nigeria. He didn't quite say it that way, but he said, sometimes when the state is failing, and when it can't provide services, and when it doesn't have mediators, they do call upon religious leaders. So, the point is, religious leaders themselves have not necessarily been trained to be servant leaders in this sense. They are servant leaders in other senses, often beautifully so. But their background and training, they are asked, your job is to protect our turf. You know, we are under threat, either by a hostile state or by another religious community. And at the end of the day, I'm going to be judged as a bishop or as an imam or as a rabbi or whatever. I'm going to be judged on whether I've kept my flock together and protected them from predators. Makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. When I was made a dean at Notre Dame, I was told by the provost, your job is you will be judged and evaluated on how well you build your unit, whether the Keough School becomes just outstanding, and you will be judged on what a team player you are for the university. These things are in conflict in a competitive environment where we deans smile at one another, we're very collegial, and we turn around and say, how do we get their resources? So, but that's kind of what a religious leader is being asked to do, to be the host and genuinely be the host in a non-arrogating to oneself authority and power. So a key part of a model of successful interreligious or intra-religious collaboration, common good, and so forth, is to cultivate, to reward, to celebrate, to thank leadership, which is servant leadership, meaning that I'm not going to stand on, it's tough, it's easy to talk about it, but it's tough to balance these competing goods for a religious leader, protecting the flock, but also doing that in a way that opens myself up and my community up to the risk of transformation. And that requires not that everybody says, I'm the host, meaning I sit at the head of this table, by the way. I am the host that is facilitating the other voices. And I'm really welcoming people in. And yes, this is my home, and I'm not apologizing for that, but my job is to serve. And this is a challenge for any leader in any context, but particularly in religions which today are so much under pressure in so many parts of the world, including our own country. So it's a challenge, but servant leadership, where hosting takes on a peace-building kind of mode, is very important. I hope that got it, at least part of that very good question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer a counterpoint to your assertion that all the religious texts have this emergency clause when they're under duress or something. That the Baha'i scriptures are actually prohibit
I couldn't hear that last part. Prohibit?
The Baha'i scriptures prohibit conflict. And the Baha'i revelation in the global society in which all the religions are authored by the same God, basically. And that kind of relates to your point that God understands us, but we don't necessarily. So that these conflicts that have gone on over the centuries were caused by men's limited understanding God.
Right. You know, the Baha'i faith, I mentioned earlier today the example of the Sikhs, and that in many of these scriptures you do have powerful testimonies to the desire for forgiveness, reconciliation, universalism under one divinity. And then there are often though, an awareness, either in the texts themselves or in the traditions that grow up, the practices around them, that we don't live in that world yet. And that even to advance the quest for unity and the ideal of one people, we have to be, to some degree, self-protective. We have to be shrewd, sly as foxes, whatever it may be, right? We have to be shrewd. And so it's very rare. The Baha'is, I don't know the Baha'i tradition very well, so you may have found the one exception to my rule. Of course, there's always someone who's going to raise it. But that may be an exception. I know the Baha'is have been persecuted, remarkably, terribly persecuted in Iran and elsewhere. So it's hard for me not to think that the Baha'is themselves are not shrewd in finding ways to balance that universalism and that peaceful message with shrewd ways of protecting their territory, their beautiful place in North Chicago, for example, and I've seen Baha'i people representing the Baha'i faith being the most aggressive lobbyists in Washington, D.C. for Baha'i. That's not a criticism. It's simply to say that these two things almost inevitably do go together. That if we have something precious, we have to protect it, we have to defend it, otherwise we get eradicated. Yes?
This would dovetail onto that a little bit. Two things that I hear people say that I certainly would hold to. Number one, people say that all religions claim that they are the only one, and I think you would probably agree that some traditions are more generous than others in accepting multiple viewpoints. And the other one is that every religion has its radicals. And I can think of 3 examples, and Baha'i is one of them. Baha'is, Jains, and then the Anabaptist traditions of the Mennonites and the Quakers and one of the Amish. I mean, when I think of a radical Jain, it might be somebody who won't use soap because they're too compassionate for bacteria. So I'm just wondering, these people don't seem to have that escape clause that you talked about. And I'm wondering if, I would like your comments on that.
Okay, my comments are going to be biased. And I'll tell you how in a minute. First of all, the Jains are the most intriguing of groups for me. Barbara and I were in India and happened to be driving into Jaipur and saw the kind of the Jain temple on the mountain, and we read a little bit in advance about the Jains. They are remarkable. You know, they will lightly sweep the path in front of them so that no one steps on an insect. They try to respect all life. They are few in number. They are ascetic, and they are rare. And one of the reasons they are rare is precisely because they seem not. They seem to have really become otherworldly, if I can use that term. So they're intriguing to me. I don't know enough about them. But I have read about their founder and about their history, and they do seem, if they do have this emergency clause, it seems muted. They don't seem at all to be self-protective. And in fact, they're so deeply devoted to every form of life and to respecting it. So I simply acknowledge this is a kind of exception, at least to my knowledge. And I find them fascinating, and they're not extinct. But in terms, if you look at it from a kind of realpolitik point of view, or you know, they're threatened, and they won't ever go out of existence, perhaps. But what they have given up on, or never aspired to, perhaps, is building their kingdom, so to speak, on earth. And that can be said of movements within Christianity and Judaism and Islam and so forth. But this is a tradition that has stood independently within the kind of Buddhist realm initially. So they're really remarkable. Here's the bias about the Mennonites, and those of you who are Mennonite. So I have an ongoing friendly conversation with John Paul Lederach, who's Mennonite, and I am Catholic. And therefore, I am someone who says, John Paul, I'm exaggerating both of our positions here, but he says, I don't trust institutions. I don't trust these, building up the empire, so to speak, for the kingdom of God. I don't trust, he's a good Mennonite in that sense. That's his sensibility. And I would respond to him, well, then maybe we shouldn't have your children go to school here at Notre Dame where I've been working to build the institution that serves you. And he, being much holier than I am, that is to say holy as opposed to not, lets this roll off his back. But it's two different points of view, and we need the Mennonites as a witness to nonviolence and to not caring, by which I mean not caring about certain aspects of the broader religious family. So we each have our charisms. I don't think the world can do without people like this Catholic, or not me personally, but who thinks, okay, we're responsible for the world, we're going to get our hands dirty, and we're going to be involved in statecraft and diplomacy and institution building, and we'll take our lumps before, God at the end of time, because we've considered ourselves co-responsible for stewardship of this. And the Mennonites have a somewhat different. When I was getting John Paul to come teach at Notre Dame, I went to the Mennonites, and I said, okay, how can we exchange this wonderful Mennonite and bring you a Catholic to your faculty? Of course, they didn't want any part of us. But they said, I said, do you have bishops? Remind me, do you have bishops? And one of them said, yeah, but we're trying to get rid of them. Well, we Catholics need our bishops. So this is, I mean this all lightheartedly, but it is true that, the takeaway from this is that I would not say the Mennonites are not self-protective. I mean, they have been persecuted. It's hard to find a religious community that has not been. But they have certainly had a history of persecution and of washing their hands of the state, the dirty, rotten state. But about 30 years ago, the Mennonites said they started rethinking that. And John Paul himself is a tremendous peace builder who has to deal with states, including the Colombian state right now. And he and others spoke to their Mennonite colleagues and said, okay, we got to be very cautious, very careful, avoid the errors of the Catholics and others, not that they put it that way, but avoid the errors that come with engaging the powers of the world. So there's an internal debate within that tradition about how far to go, because they were conscientious objectors and so forth, and then they recognized that the state does both protect them, and that the state, that if we're going to bring the kingdom of God in any recognizable way to earth, we have to deal with states, nation states. So they're in all seriousness, a very interesting story of the 20th century and how they're rethinking this very live issue of how much do we kind of institutionalize our charism and risk getting involved in sometimes dirty conflict, so to speak, while preserving that charism that Christ is the Prince of Peace and the apostle of nonviolence, and we're apostles of nonviolence. So it's a great question.
I think we need to wind it up there. Dr. Appleby, you challenged us this afternoon. You've given us hope this evening. We appreciate very much what you've done for us.
Thank you.